Okay, so this is going to be a little quick installation in this series of lectures about the Neolithic in the Fertile Crescent in our early days unit. Oops, this is not the slide that I meant to be on. Here we go. Okay, we're now going to look at some groups of people: the Akkadians, the Neo-Sumerians, the Babylonians, and the Hittites, kind of very briefly. So this is the head, oops, I don't know why I keep doing that. This is the head of an Akkadian king, okay? And so basically in 2334 BC, the city-state of Sumer becomes united under this ruler called Sargon of Akkad, and Akkad is kind of near Babylon. So united, whenever you hear united when you're talking about history, usually that means conquered brutally and violently. Okay? So Sargon of Akkad comes along and unites all of these Sumerian city-states. And the Akkadians are an interesting group. They're Semitic. Semitic meaning they were Near Eastern people whose spoken language was related to both Hebrew and Arabic. Also, what's interesting at this time is we have different spoken languages that vary, but everyone is using cuneiform for the written language. So the same kind of writing is adapted to different verbal languages, which is kind of interesting. So their language was Akkadian, and it was different than Sumerian, but they both used cuneiform to write, which is kind of interesting, I think. Okay, so let's look at some art. This is the head of an Akkadian king, maybe Sargon, probably a little later than Sargon though, and it embodies this new concept of absolute monarchy. So not a bunch of different kind of independent city-states, but everyone united under one ruler who's the head guy in charge. And this develops at this time. The head is all that remains of what would have been a very large sculpture that was destroyed when Medes sacked Nineveh at 612 BC. That doesn't matter. So the capital city where this is held is sacked by another entity, and the sculpture is destroyed. But the head is still around, so we're able to learn some things from it. So let's look at this a little bit. It's kind of interesting. We can see some things here, like a balance between naturalism and abstract patterning. So we have fairly proportionally scaled features, eyes, nose, mouth, that kind of thing. They look human, right? So some naturalism going on there. But then look at the beard. Look at the all the perfectly done little kind of corkscrews. Look at the lines inscribed in the hair along the side of the headpiece. So we have this kind of very abstract patterning applied onto this naturalized sort of scale of features. So it's an interesting combination between these two things. Okay, one of the most important pieces to come out of this time period is this one. This is a stele. A stele, S-T-E-L-E, means it's basically like a sculpture. It's like a plinth or a kind of like a megalith, but not as big, and it's carved, generally speaking. So there's a guy named King Hammurabi. He's the king of Babylon. You may have heard of Babylon. Babylon's pretty famous. Also in the Marvel movie The Eternals, we have the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. That movie really did cover a lot of, kind of touch on a lot of things that appear in this art history class, which is kind of interesting. Okay, so King Hammurabi of Babylon, he decides that he likes this idea of a ruler, of an absolute ruler to unite and control all of these city-states. So he kind of takes this idea from Sargon, but he thinks it will be helpful if he writes down rules that people have to follow, because now everyone's gathered in a society. We haven't really had laws yet. Writing is still pretty new. The idea of a stable society that stays in one place instead of chasing herds of bison around is relatively new. So he's like, all right, I'm going to write down the laws. So basically, he formulates a comprehensive law code for his people. This is the earliest set of written laws, and we don't see something similar until way later, about 1,000 years later, when we see the Greeks do something similar. The code is written in Akkadian in 3,500 lines of cuneiform, so pretty long. This whole thing, it's hard to see in this picture, but the whole bottom part of this sculpture, the stele, is covered in cuneiform writing, and you can kind of see in the close-up picture there what that looks like. So Hammurabi reestablished the centralized government. Much of the region had returned to these city-states in the centuries prior to his rule. To also reinforce these laws and make sure people take them seriously and take him seriously as their monarch, as their ruler, we have Hammurabi, and he is the figure that is standing, and he is being handed a scroll with these rules on it. He's being handed down this law, and it's being handed to him by this figure who's seated and has these flames coming off of their shoulders. And that figure, the flame-shouldered figure, is the sun god Shamash. So Shamash is an important god in Babylon. He's kind of their main guy. And so this implies that these laws written on the stele weren't just written by King Hammurabi, but were actually written by God. So that sort of reinforces his right to tell people what to do and to enforce the laws. We will see this used throughout art history, this idea of using visual representation of art to reinforce rule, to reinforce someone's right to rule and their laws. So this is kind of the earliest political propaganda piece that we see, in that he wants it carved in stone that these are the laws, you have to follow them because he says you have to follow them, and why do you have to do what he says? Because God told you to, okay? So this is a very interesting thing that sort of sets a precedent that we will see later in some other examples that we look at. Okay, the Babylonian Empire is successful for a long time. It topples under the Hittites. The Hittites are an Anatolian people, meaning they come from what is now Turkey. They conquer Babylon in 1595 BC, and the Hittites then leave Babylon after they conquer it. They're like, we're going to go back to Anatolia where we come from. We like it better there. So they leave, and then the Kassites kind of take over what was Babylon. All right. So the Hittites leave. They go back to their homeland, which is in modern-day Turkey. And this gate is part of the remains of the Hittites' heavily fortified capital city. So the city was constructed of heavy stone, which is a big contrast to the cities we see in Mesopotamia, in Babylon, and those kind of areas, which were made out of brick. Brick being fired clay, fired mud, basically. So stone is harder to break down, harder to attack. It's more fortified, it's more protectable. Very much a group of people who were interested in being prepared to be attacked, okay? The city is entirely made out of these giant boulders. It's also guarded at its main gate by these two 7-foot-tall lions, which are carved out of these large stones. This is the first example that we have of monumental figurative sculpture, meaning not just big megalith rocks that are set out, but actual carved stone at a monumental scale. It's 7 feet tall, and here they're being used as kind of guardians of the city, which is pretty cool. Okay, next we're going to look to the east of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon. We have the Elamites occupying southern Iran, and we'll talk about the Elamites and Elam and what's going on over there.